Welcome right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the absolute greatest psychological and philosophical masterpieces ever written, and that's Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Now, we aren't just going to give you a basic plot summary here. Instead, we're going to perform a full-blown psychological autopsy on the main character. We're going to track the intense, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual journey of Rodion Raskolnikov, mapping out his terrifying descent into crime and his incredibly difficult ascent toward redemption. So, to really get what's happening in this journey, we have to start with the massive philosophical puzzle sitting right at the center of the story. Can morality be transcended by genius? Like, what actually gives a person the right to judge someone else? And for our protagonist, this isn't just some fun late-night thought experiment. It becomes a literal, deadly obsession. Phase 1, the extraordinary man theory. Okay, let's set the stage. We meet Rodion Raskolnikov. He's a brilliant, incredibly proud former student, but he's living in just crushing poverty and total isolation in St. Petersburg. And when you're completely isolated like that, your mind can go to some pretty dark places. His intellect becomes dangerously detached from reality, and he cooks up what he calls the extraordinary man theory. He essentially believes humanity is split right down the middle. You've got ordinary people who just have to obey the rules, and then you have extraordinary individuals. Think people like Napoleon. Raskolnikov genuinely believes these rare people have the right to break the law, to literally step over moral boundaries as long as it serves some greater historical purpose. Because think about it, Napoleon caused immense suffering, but history calls him great, right? So Raskolnikov starts wondering, are moral laws actually universal, or can exceptional people just ignore them entirely? It doesn't take long for this highly theoretical idea to get all tangled up with his own bitter poverty. He starts methodically rationalizing a truly terrible plan. He zeroes in on a target, Alyona Ivanovna. She's an elderly pawnbroker who exploits desperate, vulnerable people. Now, his surface-level justification is pure, cold logic. He figures, hey, if I kill her, I'm removing a parasite from society, and I can take her hoarded cash to do some actual good in the world. But beneath all that noble-sounding utilitarian logic, there is a deeply ego-driven secret motive. He just wants to test himself. He desperately needs to know if he is actually one of those extraordinary supermen. Phase 2, a flawed murder. This abstract intellectual game of his is about to violently crash into the real world. After literally weeks of obsessive planning, just pacing back and forth in his tiny room, he puts the theory to the test. Armed with an axe, he goes to the pawnbroker, pretending he's there to pawn a silver cigarette case. He waits for the exact moment her back is turned, and while they're alone, he executes her. And for one fleeting, terrible second, it looks like his master plan worked perfectly. The abstract theory actually translated into reality. But then, enter Lizaveta. This is where Dostoevsky brilliantly shows us how fast reality shatters our perfect little illusions. Right while Raskolnikov is frantically searching the apartment, Alyona's half-sister unexpectedly walks through the door. And Lizaveta is gentle, she's completely innocent, and she has absolutely nothing to do with his grand philosophical justifications. In a state of sheer, blind, terrifying panic, Raskolnikov brutally murders her too. Now, why does this matter so much? Because that second, completely unplanned murder instantly wrecks his entire intellectual framework. He cannot possibly justify killing an innocent woman as some calculated sacrifice for the greater good. Lizaveta's death exposes the incredibly ugly reality of violence, and it reveals this massive, unbridgeable gap between his clean, abstract theory and messy, lived experience. He ends up fleeing the scene in pure terror, with barely anything to show for it. Phase 3. The weight of conscience. So Raskolnikov actually manages to escape without getting arrested on the spot, but his real punishment starts the exact second he walks out of that building. Instead of feeling like this empowered, untouchable Superman, he spirals into a feverish delirium. He's incredibly paranoid. The conscience he was so sure he could just outsmart turns out to be infinitely stronger than his brain. And making it all worse is the examining magistrate, a guy named Porfiry Petrovich. Porfiry doesn't do normal detective work. He doesn't care about physical evidence. He relies on intense psychological warfare. He actually read an article Raskolnikov published months earlier about this very theory. So Porfiry just traps him in these intense intellectual duels, subtly picking apart his philosophy. He never even directly accuses Raskolnikov. He just sits back and lets the guy's own crushing anxiety and contradictions slowly tear him apart from the inside. Phase 4, Shadows and Light. As Raskolnikov is battling the detective and his own mind, Dostoevsky surrounds him with these brilliantly designed foil characters. They are essentially walking philosophical arguments that reflect fractured pieces of Raskolnikov's own psyche. First up is his loyal friend Razumikhin. He's warm, practical, hardworking. He actually deals with life's problems head-on, which just makes Raskolnikov's miserable isolation look even more tragic. Then you have Luzhin, a wealthy lawyer trying to marry Raskolnikov's sister. Luzhin is driven entirely by calculating self-interest. The irony here is Raskolnikov absolutely despises Luzhin, totally missing the fact that Luzhin's cold, selfish logic perfectly mirrors his own murderous theory. And finally, there's Svidrigailov. He's rich, morally bankrupt, and lives completely without ethical rules. He acts as a terrifying warning of the total spiritual emptiness that awaits Raskolnikov if he actually manages to kill off his conscience. But the absolute sharpest contrast in the entire story is Sonya Marmeladova. The comparison between the two is just stunning. On one hand, you have Raskolnikov's intellect, desperately trying to justify horrific violence through sheer pride and abstract theory. On the other hand, you have Sonya's compassion. She is a young woman who was literally forced into prostitution just to keep her desperately poor, alcoholic father's family from starving. And yet, despite going through immense degradation, she hasn't lost an ounce of her humanity. She endures all of it with endless patience, profound empathy, and deep religious faith. She is entirely grounded in love, whereas he is entirely grounded in cold logic.
Phase 5, the path to redemption.
Eventually, the sheer weight of the guilt and the secrets just breaks him. The extraordinary Superman he wanted to be, he finally realizes that guy never even existed. Unable to carry it alone for one more second, he goes to Sonya and confesses everything. And how does she react? Not with horror. She responds with overwhelming compassion. She literally hands him a cross, representing a chance for spiritual rebirth, and she tells him he has to confess publicly. He needs to embrace the suffering to find renewal. It's her empathy, definitely not some clever intellectual argument, that finally breaks through his walls. So, he surrenders to the authorities, and his grand theory completely and utterly collapses. Now, turning himself into the cops is not the end of the story. It's honestly just step one. Jump ahead a few months. He's serving out his sentence in a Siberian prison camp, and Sonya has actually followed him there. But get this, he's still holding on to his pride. He's literally in penal servitude, and he still thinks of the murder as nothing more than a failed experiment. It takes years of Sonya's rock-solid loyalty to finally grind down that arrogant pride. She slowly teaches him to genuinely accept his guilt and recognize that he is connected to the rest of humanity. It isn't until the very, very end of the narrative that he finally opens his heart to genuine love, humility, and faith. The legal sentence was a fixed number of years, sure, but his actual moral rebirth takes years of agonizing internal struggle. So what is the big takeaway from all of this? What does this explainer really come down to? Ultimately, the story forces us to look at what happens when a person tries to elevate themselves above morality only to brutally discover that you cannot escape being human. Raskolnikov's towering intellect and his ego completely failed him because we just aren't wired to live on cold reason alone. We absolutely cannot sever the moral ties that bind us to one another. I want to leave you with one final, pretty heavy thought to chew on today. If you completely stripped away the laws of society right now, would your conscience alone be enough to govern you? It's a huge question. But as our protagonists learned the hardest way possible, our humanity and the conscience deeply woven into it is something none of us can ever truly walk away from. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep exploring those big questions.